1968, including massive anti-Vietnam protests on college campuses in the US and in the streets of London. In France, students and workers protested the old political order, and indeed more than 10 million, 22% of the total population, went on strike for 2 continuous weeks, occupying French universities and factories and almost bringing down the government. These demonstrations were orchestrated primarily by young people, mostly baby boomers, who rose up against the post-World War II power structure in the West, hoping to dismantle a political, economic, and social system that they regarded as unjust. They took to the streets of major cities and around the world, demonstrating against capitalism, American imperialism, and the consumerism that followed in its wake. At the same time, there were demonstrations in Eastern Europe, from Poland to Yugoslavia, that focused on freedom of speech and the violation of civil rights by the communist authorities. Earlier in the 60s, anti-colonial national liberation movements had succeeded in achieving independence. In sub-Saharan Africa in 1960 alone, 17 states became independent of France. When the Algerian National Liberation Front emerged victorious in its fights against French colonial oppression, their success became an inspiration, almost a blueprint, for the birth of groups like the Black Panthers, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Irish Republican Army, and others. As the decade advanced, however, political optimism waned, with events such as the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Prague Spring, Mao's brutal cultural revolution, the outbreak of the troubles in Northern Ireland, Tlatelolco, in the Tlatelolco massacre of students and civilians by police in Mexico City just 10 days before the Olympics, and the defeat of guerrilla insurgencies in Latin America by Latin American dictators, epitomized by the execution of Ernesto Che Guevara in October of 1967. In the US, the murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy and the election of Richard Nixon as president of 1968 were also were markers of this sea change. Yet at the same time, against the backdrop of the Cold War and the ubiquitous violent conflicts everywhere, the decade gave rise to the civil rights movement, the women's movement. This is second wave feminism, the gay and lesbian liberation movement, and the environmental movement, generating a sense of hope and progress as well. Starting with the Summer of Love in 1967, many young people chose to leave the cities, rejecting technology and establishment politics, and seeking alternative communities in nature. The utopian impulse expressed itself in the many outdoor festivals that took place toward the end of the decade, which enabled many of the young participants to enact their vision of a liberated counterculture. On both the personal and the political level, then, the decade's movements shifted paradigms of social justice and individual freedoms in ways that have continued to resonate. But in spite of advances in political justice on some fronts and an expansion in the range of political lifestyle choices, how much difference the putatively cataclysmic year 1968 really made is an open question. Over the next 2 days, the scholars assembled here will explore the meaning of 1968 in different parts of the world. They will address how authority, legitimacy, and power were exercised and challenged in the political, economic, social, and cultural realms, and will offer their thoughts about what we can learn from 1968, now 50 years later. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to offer some thank yous. There are several people that did a lot of work behind the scene, and they need to be recognized publicly. First, Charlotte Tate. Where are you, Charlotte? Charlotte Tate, who did a lot of the work. Many of you participants don't even know how much, and you just met her this afternoon. I also like to thank Jennifer Nusider, right there, our coordinator, for making all the arrangements associated with the conference before the nor'easter and during the storm. Only those of you who came here, who traveled more than 24 hours, know how much work she's done. And lastly, I want to thank Carlos Cariza. Where are you, Carlo? He's our, the center's outreach fellow. He's the outreach fellow who prepared all the posters, the programs, and all the materials that you have in your hands and that you will have later in the afternoon when you come and join us up the hill. And lastly, I would like to thank again my co-organizers, Professor Williams and Vasquez. Thank you really all very, very much. I would like to express my gratitude to the Reutens Center Faculty Steering Committee and the Center's Student Advisory Board for their input, and to the following departments and programs that co-sponsored the conference, and the list is long. Department of English and American Literatures, Lois 51 and J. Harvey Watson Department of French and Francophone Studies, Department of Geography, Department of History, Department of History of Art and Architecture, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Program in Gender, Sexuality, Feminist Studies, International Programs and Off-Campus Studies, and Brainerd Commons. I also want to let you know that the rest of the conference will take place at the Raj, at the Reutens Center up the hill, and it will begin tonight at 7 o'clock. It's on the second floor. For those of you who do not know, it's on the second floor of the Reutens Center. Dinner will be available for all the people who want to join us for the second session, and there is a lot of food, and I can assure you that that session at 7 o'clock is going to be very, very interesting. So now I'd like to turn and introduce our keynote speaker. It is really a great pleasure to introduce Todd Gitlin, an American sociologist, political writer, communication scholar, novelist, and cultural commentator. He's the author of 16 books. Some of them are popular and others are scholarly. He writes about mass media, intellectual arts and life, and about politics. Yes, I'm not going to read all the 16 titles, but I'm just going to say that some of his titles are incredibly relevant to our theme, to the theme of our conference, and I'm just going to only jot a few. One of them from 2012 is Occupy Nation, The Roots, the Spirits, and the Promise of Occupy Wall Street. Then there is a 2003 book called Letters to a Young Activist. 1999, The Twilight Common Dream, Why America is Wrecked by Culture Wars. An earlier book called The Whole World is Watching, Mass Media in the Making and Unmaking of the New Left. And of course, the 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage. Professor Gitlin, who holds degrees from Harvard University, he has a BA in mathematics from Harvard, from a political science master's from University of Michigan, and he has a PhD in sociology from Berkeley, is now a professor of journalism and sociology and the chair of the PhD program in communication at Columbia University. He has held positions at the University of California, Berkeley, where at least one of his students, Rob, where are you? One of his students, one of our colleagues was his student in the sociology, in a big sociology class in 1975, 1976? So, okay, in the 70s. We're not going to date anybody. He also taught at NYU and in Yale and in Oslo and Toronto and Shanghai and Hong Kong and Tunis and Cairo and Switzerland, a world traveler. Todd Gitlin is known also for his activism, which started when he was a sophomore in college. Students, please take note. Started when he was a sophomore in college. He joined the Harvard Radcliffe Group Tocsin, a student organization that would become active in the radical call for nuclear disarmament. It was 1960. 2 years later, he helped organize a national demonstration in Washington against the arms race and nuclear testing. In 1963 and 1964, at the age of 20, he was elected president of the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. We have another card-holding member of SDS, which as the what? Caring. Oh, thank you. Caring, which as Todd writes in the introduction to his 60s book, SDS, what's the idea? The hope was to shake America to its roots. End of quote. He was among the organizers of the first national demonstration against Vietnam War in 1965 in Washington, D.C. 25,000 people attended that demonstration. In addition, during that year, he helped organize the civil disobedience directed against American corporate support of South Africa's apartheid regime and organized Appalachian white migrants to Chicago into an interracial movement of the poor. He wrote for and was sometimes the editor of underground newspapers. He gave speeches against the Vietnam War, walked many picket lines, visited Cuba, and was stirred by it. He continued his activism as a graduate student at Berkeley and as a young faculty member. In the mid-1980s, Todd Gitlin was a leader of Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley's faculty that advocated and pushed the regents to fully divest from apartheid South Africa. In 2013, he became involved in the alumni wing of the Divest Harvard movement, seeking the university's exit from fossil fuel corporations. He has done the same at Columbia University. For almost 50 years, Todd Gitlin, the prolific writer, has embodied activism from which I believe he has drawn many lessons. Therefore, it is so fitting to have him address the issue of the ambiguous consequences of failed revolutions. Please join me in welcoming Todd Gitlin to Middlebury. This one.
Okay,
Carlo,
we're going.
here, wait, we're going. Carlo will come and make sure that everything works and puts everything and...
I
this
warn
is-
you, I'm the kiss of death.
I know. Well, you're going to use
So
this
this-
thing? You're going to use,
which
you
one?
can use this thing,
Forward?
go forward, yeah.
That's
Okay?
what I need to know.
All right.
And wait, it jumped ahead. Why did it do that? Thank you for coming. Social studies, or what some people call social sciences, like to dwell on structure, questions of structure. But texture is at least as important. And as it happens, I and the organizers were confronted or presented today with material for a parable that will serve to introduce my subject. In the past 24 hours, let's see, I changed one air reservation to another. I took the subway to a train late, missed the train, went to the airport. In the meantime, command headquarters here, control in Middlebury, was keeping tabs on my and others' movements. The storm was the storm, and the airlines were the airlines, and my faulty memory was my faulty memory. All of this actually is instructive and relevant to the problem of understanding 1968, because it was the texture of the year that is extremely hard to make real or to make vivid, and yet is essential to understanding what happened. I'm going to take a hop, skip, and jump through the year, and maybe I will have made it clearer what I mean. So, periods when much of the world seems to play in a single key are rare, dazzling, mysterious, and since history does not travel in a straight line, Barack Obama said that, a time like 1968 was, to say the least, complicated and dizzying in its texture and in its effects. But was there a singular 1968? What did the Czechoslovakian students who faced down the 165,000 soldiers of the Warsaw Pact who spilled into the country, and the parallel rebels against one-party dictatorship in Poland and Mexico have to do with women who dumped their girdles, bras, and hair curlers into a trash can outside Atlantic City's Miss America pageant? Who was to know that beauty contests would once again play a part in our lives? Never mind, couldn't resist. What did LSD and marijuana have to do with the discovery that human beings are unbreakably bonded to nature? What did rock and roll have to do with racial equality and modern history's most effective movement to put an end to the carnage of war? What did it mean to say that the personal was political? And the 1968 answer was, more or less, somehow or other, all the overturnings, all the probes into the unknown, all the revelations had something to do with each other. Yes, they were a blur without a clear objective. They were curled around each other, snarled up with each other, in a complicated pattern, maybe indecipherable, but in any event, immense and apparently unprecedented. You may not have figured out what the something was that these things had to do with each other, but somehow it or they had figured you out. They had an agenda for you. History was alive, and you could make it. You could change your life. You had to change your life. And it was to the largest population ever educated, as if no one had ever been young before, which is, of course, the illusion of the young that helps keep them young, but also invites them to stare at the sun and blinds them. To millions, the horror of Vietnam was a... Sorry, I get carried away. Can I close this without interfering with the slideshow? Can I close the lid? And still click forward? Because it's my... That's what I keep doing. Put it down here. Ah, yes, there we go. Very good. Great. To millions, the horror of Vietnam was an urgent standing invitation not just to stop it, but to change your life accordingly. And Americans were acutely aware in general that the year 1968 began with 15,997 Americans dead in the war and ended with 30,586 dead. The war was costing $2 to $3 billion per month. And around the world, of course, people were even more acutely aware of the vastly more numerous Vietnamese dead, maimed, and driven from their homes, several million by the time the war was over. But the horror of the war dovetailed with a growing and even desperate giddiness, a faith that Vietnamese resistance might keep the American onslaught at bay. 1968 was itself the culmination of years of insurgency, but it's worth a flashback to a precedent, to an earlier global, paraglobal phenomenon. Before 1968 came 1848, the year of Europe's small r Republican revolts against empire in France, Italy, Germany, and indeed in most all of Europe, and with international ramifications. Almost all of them were defeated, but their defeats nourished freedom-loving democratic movements to come. When the Hungarian rebel leader Lajos Kossuth came to New York just after Christmas 1851, the city roused itself to what the New York Sun called, and I quote from the time, Kossuth mania. Every New Year's gift associated itself in some designation with Kossuth and Hungary. Restaurants abounded with Hungarian goulash. There were Kossuth cravats, Kossuth pipes, Kossuth umbrellas, Kossuth belts and buckles, Kossuth purses, Kossuth jackets, and Kossuth braid and tassels. He got a parade down Broadway. He met in the White House not once, but twice with President Millard Fillmore. And that's 2 blocks from my apartment today. They deliver, the Hungarian mission to the UN delivers flowers once a year. Daniel Webster wrote his biography. Lincoln organized the celebration in Kossuth's honor in Springfield, Illinois, and called him a most worthy and distinguished representative of the cause of civil and religious liberty on the continent of Europe. Kossuth had an influence on Lincoln. And then there was Franz Siegel. I knew it would go wrong. Oh, there he is, okay. Franz Siegel was a leader of the German Revolutionary Forces of 1848 with the rank of colonel, being one of the few revolutionaries with military command experience. He emigrated to the U.S. after being chased from one country to another for a while, went to work teaching in New York City public schools, was later elected director of the St. Louis Public Schools in 1960, and went to work attracting Germans to the Union and anti-slavery causes when he openly supported them in 1861, whereupon Lincoln appointed him a general in the Civil War. These were the members of the generation of 48. Carl Schurz is another one, rather well better known than Franz Siegel. His record is more complicated, which is suitable for our conversation about 1968. Carl Schurz was a German 48er who was forced into exile into France, then forced out of France, migrated to the U.S., threw himself also into the anti-slavery Republican Party, became a Union general in the Civil War also, and then a senator from Missouri. But he opposed President Grant in 1870 on 2 grounds. He was against the annexation of Santo Domingo, but he also opposed Grant's use of the military to destroy the Ku Klux Klan in the South. That is to say, he opposed, in effect, Reconstruction. But enough of 1848. Which was one uprising, which was this chain of freedom-loving nationalist inspirations. But to 1968, which was one uprising after another against illegitimate authority. It was also a revolt against suffocation, against the herd, and against violent death, and in behalf of Eros. It was self-affirmation with or without a political edge. There was a popular movie in 1966, 67 or something, called Not With My Wife You Don't, and this button was a play on it. It was wild, thrilling, horrific, and not least televised. It was vertigo, nausea, astonishment, a delirium of hopes and nightmares. The texture of experience was thick, unstuck, and madly, perversely contradictory. And not just in America. In one country after another, rebellion clambered to its feet and charged at authority. Authority was guilty until proved innocent. Unsurprisingly, authority fought back to repel the rebels. The spirit of apocalypse was ubiquitous, although its revelations were often uncertain in the extreme. In the less quoted sequel to his best of times peroration, in The Tale of Two Cities, Dickens, I think, did a good job anticipating the sort of mental whiplash that became common in 1968. Whoops, we don't have that slide. All right, well, I don't have it memorized, sorry. Look it up yourself. In 1968, too, history was either ending or beginning. or both at once. Hope was planted, hope was uprooted. Heroes stepped forward, and so did assassins. All over South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, and Viet Cong Tet Offensive put the lie to the fantasy that the U.S. was approaching that famous light at the end of the tunnel. Robert Lowell later wrote a poem saying that that light was the light of the oncoming train. Not yet come to light was the murder of several hundred unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai on March 16th. We're coming up on a 50th anniversary of that. I don't think there'll be too many nationally. There is an event at Columbia, but I don't think there'll be too many national commemorations. Tet fueled Eugene McCarthy's, Robert Kennedy's, and George Wallace's challenges to the incumbent President Lyndon Johnson, leading in turn to the administration's conclusion that the war could not be won and Johnson's decision not to run for a second term. There were parties in the streets when he made that announcement, and the anti-war movement rejoiced. Spikes of joy, days of anguish and rage. 4 days later, came the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, where he had gone, as many do not know today, to support a strike of garbage workers, sanitation workers, who were trying to organize a union. On February 1st, 1968, during the Tet Offensive, in fact, a downpour forced two sanitation workers, to seek shelter in the back of their old trash truck. The compactor kicked in and crushed them to death. That was the last straw for the workers who had achieved a union charter but no recognition from the city. And they marched day after day, facing police brutality and racial hostility, and the strike became a strike for basic human dignity. They came up with the sign that captured in 4 words the quintessence of what we used to call humanism. I am a man, of course, was the gender-neutral term of the time. After King was dead, riots or rebellions broke out in hundreds of cities. And there came also this iconic, there he is. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. The season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. That image, of course, iconic in Mexico City. In May, the Paris student movement was ignited when retrograde university authorities tried to police sex on campus. That was actually the igniting issue, the Nanterre campus, which led to that event, that kind of movement. And as Professor Meyer mentioned, also the outpouring of students, an explosion that rocked the government of Charles de Gaulle. I'll be back to that subject and these quotes later on. A French socialist named Henri Weber said the movement was democratic and liberatory, hedonistic and communitarian, romantic and messianic. And in a different key came these massive worker strikes. But the students and the workers, despite their attempts and occasional invocations of transcendent solidarity, were not on the same page. De Gaulle recovered, and France proceeded in the next month to elect a conservative government, actually the most fully conservative government in the history of the Republic, which was an outcome that the veterans of '68 could never quite get their minds around. In Czechoslovakia, the reform communism of Prague Spring led to the Soviet invasion of August. Socialism with a human face, which was a slogan of the Prague Spring, was one of the slogans. There's an outdoor meeting, and there's the throng greeting the Warsaw Pact tanks. After the assassination of Robert Kennedy, June 6th, the last hope expired for an anti-war resolution at the Democratic Convention in August, let alone an anti-war candidate. This was one of the markers. There was such signs were carried in Chicago. Chicago police under political command. This was not a police riot. This was an assault organized from headquarters. Savaged several thousand demonstrators, most of them nonviolent, a few of them provocatives, themselves spoiling for a fight, and some of those in the pay of government agencies. Some of the savagery broke into national television, and many of the delegates were decidedly unimpressed with the Democratic nominee, Hubert Humphrey, who was committed to President Johnson's war policies and had moreover run in no primaries. And Humphrey ended up losing by a hair in November, and the spectacle of blood, tear gas, and fixed bayonets on the streets in the end helped tip the electoral balance to the law and order candidacy of Richard M. Nixon. The proud segregationist George Wallace won almost 10% of the vote and 13.5% of the Electoral College in November, carried 5 deep southern states, and combined with Nixon's visceral Cold War belligerence, heralded the Republicans' reinvention as the party of the Confederacy, which, as you've noticed, we're still living with or under. The spirit of opening portals to immense changes ramified. What could not be called into question? Medical students revolted against the orthodoxies of their profession. Patients demanded information. Scientists, city planners, teachers, no profession was without its own anti-war caucus and its own questioning of the orthodoxies of the profession. And most sweepingly of all, wives and girlfriends and eventually lesbians revolted against the most ancient of all impositions of power. Feminists of the women's liberation movement, as it called itself, demonstrated at the Miss America pageant against the objectification of women. Imagine. On the right, the Freedom Trash Can is what actually happened. Nobody actually burned a bra, but this has become notorious as the great bra burning demonstration. The signs on the left are also interesting because they tell you something about the radicalism underlying a great deal of the women's movement. And then there was West Germany. Talk about a revolt against authoritarians. The generation born during the war had never been told the recognizable truth about the Nazi regime by their parents. Nazi collaborators, including West Germany's President Heinrich Lübke, were everywhere in the free world government. The student movement was often accused of being ignorant of history, but it was their parents who were suppressing the knowledge of history, and the students who understood that they were living in history and not outside it. In October, the most eloquent leader of the German student movement, named Rudi Dutschke, was shot in the head and gravely brain damaged by a right-wing criminal. Whoops. I don't know where he went. He's probably lurking around the corner. He was shot in the head and wounded and the radical students very plausibly blamed a right-wing media campaign, a right-wing smear campaign, for having inspired the assassin. Breathtaking convulsions. What was going on? Was there an uprising of reason against the perverse caricature of reason that operated in the Cold War nuclear balance of terror and in the pulverizing bombings of peasants in Southeast Asia? Or was there, as some said, a revolt against reason itself, a call to being, if you will, a call to use drugs as tickets to get out of your mind because your mind had been seized by heavy institutional parasites, by the dullness of the everyday and the hollowness of corporate life and the stupid state? Whether you were transfixed by the glow of a revolutionary dawn or quivered in fear of the darkness, the collective reality found its voices in the so-called underground press and its soundtrack in the no longer sweet jubilation of the Beatles and the sepulchral Dionysian moans of the Doors, the hymns of Aretha Franklin, the portentous harshness of the Rolling Stones, the fervency of Jefferson Airplane, and the raunchy lamentations of Janis Joplin, among many others. Psychedelic drugs seemed to millions a way to bypass a senseless so-called reality. William Blake had written that the tigers of wrath were wiser than the horses of instruction. And now the movements were galloping even faster than that. In the heart of the insurgency, political or not, it felt that those who were, as somebody once said, not busy being born were busy dying. History was wild. It had come off the leash. I'm going to go to Mexico here. I'm going to interrupt my own narrative because this was a demonstration in the run-up to the Olympics, after which several hundred students were massacred, an event barely acknowledged until the last few years in Mexico City. From the distance of half a century, it's the whole crazy amalgam, the wildness, the sense of looming apocalypse and possibility that's so startling and hard to make sense of. It's the sheer surprise, the courage, the recklessness, and mystery, the moral passion and delusion, and often plain inchoateness, the sheer out-of-the-blueness that brings dumb life to so many cliches, most of which are, in a way, accurate. One thing you could say was that the world was not frozen. Nothing could be taken for granted. Traditions were shredded. Public and private worlds were open. Intimacy was reworked. All kinds of cooperation might be possible. Sweep away the old. Let the repressed return. So what happened? The grand illusion of all these movements was that because they were in motion, they were in command of history. Some of the repressed that returned was the opposite of democratic. Backlash happened. Richard Nixon was elected president. Enough anti-war Democrats refrained from voting or voted for a fringe ticket to escort Nixon into the White House. The result was 7 more years of war, eventually unplugged by congressional legislation, but only after 58,000 Americans were dead and several million Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians. And so too, for example, in France, as I mentioned, the legislative elections that took place elected a strong right-wing government, and the striking workers went back to their jobs. The prime minister had campaigned for the defense of the republic in the face of a communist threat, and he called for the silent majority, also Nixon's term, to make themselves heard. The inertia of normality imposes itself. Exhaustion, as one of the panels is entitled. While the culture of resistance and revolt is growing, America, at least, is otherwise occupied. Business rolls on. The rhetoric of revolution indulged in by some would-be revolutionaries and their die-hard opponents masks the actuality. Life goes on, bread is baked and delivered. The system, as Herbert Marcuse said, delivered the goods. These are the most popular American entertainment series of the year 1968-69. Laugh-In was a satirical effort which occasionally took a poke at Nixon and the war. Julia was a show about an African-American nurse. It was the first series to feature an African-American woman. But the rest of this was something else. This was not the America that the movement was living in. This was the America that thought the movement was disruptive and dangerous. And repression happens. Activists murdered, in exile, in prison, and trapped in revolutionary fantasies. This is the body of Fred Hampton, who was the head of the Black Panther Party of Chicago. He was a young man in his early 20s. He was drugged by an FBI infiltrator, and then the apartment where he and others were living was attacked by the police. He was shot dead in his bed. Absorption happens. Energy dissipates. Movements fragment. And so does the military, by the way. The war, by this time, is now wholly unsustainable, and Richard Nixon, who is not a dummy as a politician, ended the draft and promoted the 18-year-old vote. And the culture of rebellion, in many ways, this is an oversimplification, becomes the culture. Youth culture, anyway. Cultural rebellion becomes a thing. The market is where to express yourself. Be yourself, buy. So, in 1969, the country singer Merle Haggard had a huge hit with Okie from Muskogee. Some of the words are, "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. We don't take our trips on LSD. We don't burn our draft cards down on Main Street. We like living right and being free." And here he is in 1980. Styles change. History also operates behind our backs. Nixon overreaches and political rebellion triumphs. Goon squads operate out of the White House, but they run into mighty obstacles. An honest judge, honest journalists, honest civil servants, honest congressional investigators. And Nixon is left with no choice but surrender. By 1973, the luxury of cheap energy has exploded in the oil crisis. Say goodbye to the expectation of endless affluence. Face scarcity. But then what the literary historian Richard Slotkin called wild history goes on, with its own principles, its own paradoxes, and its own trajectory. Now, I'm going to have to interrupt the chronology. People are always curious about what lessons are to be learned. I would have a different list tomorrow because my mind is never quite settled, but here are a few for today. First is that movements run out of steam. Movements are exhausting and often destructive to the people who are most dedicated to them. The energy dissipates, and when that energy does not connect to an engine, when the energy dissipates in the open air and does not drive pistons, to use a fossil fuel image one day nobody will understand, things don't happen. Institutions are the engines, and they are hard to build and easy to destroy. Another lesson: if a movement assaults authority and fails to pick up the pieces, that is to say, fails to be organized and prepared to govern, somebody else will pick up the pieces. Those who are organized and prepared to rule. In this case, Nixon. Another more recent case, Tahrir Square, Arab Spring 2011. As you all know, the movement to overthrow Mubarak was started by a Facebook page. That's true. Famously showing the face of a beaten, badly mauled, mutilated young Egyptian. And in summons, many millions of people turned out to demonstrate against the regime. But those who turned out had, as in so many cases in the age of Twitter, discovered they are not organized to persist. The organizers did not have a party. They did not have a continuing network. And so Mubarak was succeeded by an organization that was prepared to govern, and that was the Muslim Brotherhood for a while, until they in turn were displaced by another institution that was prepared to govern, namely the military, and they're still in power. Third lesson: movements leave residues. Black lives are still taken pointlessly by police, but there are no lynchings as regular features of everyday life. Values of democratic insurrection persist: equality of condition, resistance, community, and white wealth still overwhelms black wealth. The achievements are embattled. We could talk about that for a long time. Fourth, history offers no guarantees of moral progress. 1966, when Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California against the rioters in Watts and the students at the University of California in Berkeley, they won. They won big. the onslaught of imagery lent itself to the kind of polarization of sunny America versus forces of disruption and disorder. And then there's him. By the way, the star is for television. This is the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Notice the little of course, you don't know what television ears are, do you? But anyway, that's how television used to receive signals. So here, my point is that one of the great stories that I'm not telling here about what happened in the 1960s was television, but that's another story. No victories are final, finally. No victors are final, and neither are defeats. Here's our great national poet, writing about the revolutionaries of 1848. These are excerpts. Courage yet, my brother or my sister, keep on. Liberty is to be subserved, whatever occurs. That is nothing that is quelled by one or two failures or any number of failures, or by the indifference or ingratitude of the people, or by any unfaithfulness, or the show of the tushers of power, soldiers, cannon, penal statutes. What we believe in waits latent forever through all the continents, invites no one, promises nothing, sits in calmness and light, is positive and composed, knows no discouragement, waiting patiently, waiting its time. When there are no more memories of heroes and martyrs, and when all life and all the souls of men and women are discharged from any part of the earth, then only shall liberty or the idea of liberty be discharged from that part of the earth, and the infidel come into full possession. Then courage, European revolter, revoltress, for till all ceases, neither must you cease. I do not know what you are for. I do not know what I am for myself, nor what anything is for. But I will search carefully for it, even in being foiled, in defeat, poverty, misconception, imprisonment. For they too are great. Did we think victory great? So it is. But now it seems to me, when it cannot be helped, that defeat is great, and that death and dismay are great. Or, if you prefer a more recent version from a more recent sage, there's no success like failure, and failure's no success at all. So, what was the significance of 1968? It's up to us. Thank you.
Todd, you'll take some questions, or maybe more than some. Few. All right, we have a mic, and Carlo and Charlotte are...
Will somebody do me a favor and bring me a bottle of water?
We'll bring you in a second. You run and...
Okay. No question. Some question.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, thank you. I thought there were bottles. Thank you. There's a hand here.
I have a hand. Hi. We were talking earlier. My name is Jamie McCallum. I'm in the sociology department. I have, I guess, a today question, if that's okay. And that is that I remember I think it was the Twilight of Common Dreams, where you talked about, the right taking over the White House and the left marching on the English department. I have raised that in my classes over the years, and I wonder if you think if there's something like that going on now. Or I wonder what you think about the parallels between those dynamics that were happening when you mentioned them and maybe some campus dynamics that are happening these days.
In a
Do
word,
you
yes.
get the question?
And I think it's a very important question I've been brooding over for many, many years. And I think it actually goes to something quite important about the difference between the right and the left. The right believes in power. The right has no compunctions about power. The right is, generally speaking, hierarchical. They follow the leader. The left is, in its essence, but we could talk about what the left is here, but in essence, the left is unruly. The left is anarchic. The left distrusts power, including its own, including the power of its own leaders. It has, or is at least ambivalent about its leaders. So it's very striking to me, having known a lot of people in the various movements of the 60s, given how many talented people of many kinds there were in these movements, and we're talking about millions of people who participated somehow or other in these movements, it's striking to me that we generated a relative shortfall in political leadership. So we can point to mayors, sometimes of major cities. We can point to members of Congress, a governor or two here or there, members of state legislatures, but not national power, not national power. And I think this is in no small part a function of what's essentially a difference of political character. That's my short answer to what happened. So I'm here speaking globally. We ended up with a good deal of presence in universities, especially in liberal arts universities, in part because we wanted professional lives, and we valued knowledge or chat, talk, whatever it is we do. But we also made it easy on ourselves because the life of the campus is a lot easier than the life of political combat. And therefore, while some of my best friends are English professors, it is striking how little we contributed to the political form of the sequel. Not a small. This is something to be said on a college campus. In addition, there took place on another stage in the 1960s. There took place something of a revolution in thought, which many came to call the linguistic turn. It showed up in philosophy. It showed up in political theory. It showed up in criticism, so on. And what that meant was that the attention became riveted to the power of discourse. So the theory was if you broke through the ideological veils that prevented people from seeing reality, if you deconstructed deceptive and damaging consciousness, then you would have done your job. That swept the university. And I can't help call me cynical. Note that if you think that discourse is all important, well, then it makes sense that you will feel that taking over the English department is your gift to the revolution. That happened. I have to interrupt myself here to say something that I'm kind of on fire about these days. I'm in the middle of editing a piece about voter registration. We're in the run-up to the elections, and there's this great resistance that's done all kinds of marvelous things. And I've been trying to inventory what people are doing by way of voter registration around the country, and I've talked to a number of very impressive people all over who were involved in opposing voter ID laws and supporting early voting and so on, as well as getting involved in the redistricting fights and so on. And now, of course, we see the great example of these astounding high school students who are doing their thing in the resistance, starting in Florida. I have not found very much going on university campuses. That is to say, I have not found, New York City is within 2 hours' drive of at least 4 swing districts. But as I walk onto the campus, I don't see any posters calling people to meetings to organize bus drives out to these districts on Long Island and in New Jersey, although such bus trips are being organized by a Democratic congresswoman in LA to a nearby district, which is a purple district. This is going on, and it's going on in Las Vegas, but it's not going on at the universities. And I think that requires a whole hard and unblinkered look. So, yes, that's still the same old story. Sorry to go on so long. Yeah, do we have the mic?
Thank you very much. So I want to go back to 1848, and I was thinking, because often in my classes, we'll be talking about revolution somehow, and I'll say, well, the French Revolution took over 100 years, and it then took place in many places. So you could start at 1848, but you could start at 1789, and where you stop at, right? If you stopped it at 1848, sort of 50 years later, you think one thing, and then the 18th Brumaire and, the reestablishment of authority. Then if you stopped at 1870, right, 1871, you'd say, oh, the Commune, right? That got Marx real excited. And then repression again. And then something goes forward. So in a way, I think the trajectory of these is obviously very long, right? And I think that gets to Walt Whitman's quote. Because if you ended you started at, say, 1789 and you ended in 1871, you could say, well, it was all for naught, right?
Yeah.
They had the revolution in 1789, then they had all the maybe extremism, then repression, reaction, and the Paris Commune, and then it was finished, right? And 30,000 people died. But then if you were to look at France today, for all of its problems, right, something's happened between 1789 and now, right? And you could argue that there was a French Revolution. It just wasn't 1789, right? It took 100 years. So I guess my question is, in looking at what was the significance of 1968, I think it would be a little too simple to say, well, everybody you could get hopeless. I say everybody dissipated and, everybody gave up and the left fought each other, but then there are outreaches that always come from each of these. But it's hard to see it in one time. I mean, people from 68, many did not all become, let's say, academics. Some of them became political organizers.
Some of my best friends are academics.
Exactly, and some became academics and stayed politically active, right?
Yeah.
And you have somebody like, Bernie Sanders, right? He was active in 68 in one way. He galvanized all these young people today. So I think there are just many stories over time, and I guess my point being that it's hard to say that the lesson is it all dissipates, right?
I don't mean to say it ended. That's not my argument, or maybe I wasn't clear about that. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but wonderful anyway. It's said that somebody, maybe Henry Kissinger, asked either Mao or Zhou Enlai on a visit to Beijing, what do you think was the consequence of the French Revolution? To which he was said to have responded, it's too soon to tell. Yeah. Now, so it is too soon to tell. On the other hand, I'm in a big hurry. Okay? The glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, the species are being eradicated, and so on. And here I return to my political origin. Nuclear bombs, they're there. They're in back burners. This is a problem that humanity has set for itself. I mean, it's related to the climate disaster in that it was an effusion of bravado, power over nature, power over others, that led to this tremendous achievement of human power embedded in technology, which is on its way to wrecking us. Not the planet, which will last, but us. So that's my answer. I'm impatient. But there's one other thing on continuity. I got to college in 1959. If anybody announced a conference on the activities of 1909, who would have gone? Who would have cared? Nobody in 1959 or 69 was singing the songs of 1909 or knew what they were, or seeing the iconic images of 1909 and so on. So history is telescoped, which is interesting. It affords possibilities, but I don't feel patient. Bill.
Todd, thank you so much for a great talk, and thanks for the reminder about November, New York 21, which is 20 minutes drive across the Crown Point Bridge, has an eminently flippable Republican congresswoman at the moment. 1968, it seems, sort of in retrospect, that there were sort of two very distinct things going on. One, this sort of political sense around some kind of socialism, some kind of communitarian response to, as sort of the way forward. And on the other hand, this intense sense around individual liberation. Were people at the time aware that there was a kind of underlying tension here, and how were people sort of dealing with it in their own minds at the time?
Yes, very important. Some people were aware that there was disharmony in the opposition. I was in Northern California in the late 60s, and it was quite evident that among the politicos, there were those who were quite scornful about hippies. The term counterculture was not yet used, but hippies or freaks. And then there were others who thought, well, we've got to go organize them because they have, let's say, a false consciousness about what they need. And what they need is not just trips, but political change. And you could look at many instances where these conflicts sometimes came to the surface and were not wisely handled, I think. The Yippies, whom you've probably heard of, who were a handful of people who named themselves that at a Stone New Year's Eve party, believed, and I think sincerely, although ignorantly, that this was all one big thing, that you drop acid and you march against the war. Originally, their first project was, everybody come to Chicago for the Democratic Convention. We'll have a festival of life. We'll have every musician you ever heard of. We'll be giving out drugs, and we're going to crash the Democratic Party and bring down the war. And there were many things that were foolish. Virtually everything about it was foolish. But that kind of, that played well on television. These people became stars. Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. They were embodiment of a fantasy that all of these rebellions lined up. And I think it was. And the example of France is very striking. Oh, I forgot. I told you I was going to tell you something about the slogan. I just learned something about France 68. There's an extraordinary Brazilian film I saw in New York a couple of weeks ago called In the Intense Now. It is largely about Paris and Prague 68, but there's a bit of it made up of home movies shot by the mother of the filmmaker on a trip to China in 1966 in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. Anyway, in that film, there appears an advertising, a French PR person who says, that slogan, beneath the pavement, the beach. We invented that. We, him and his PR group. Okay? I mean, that was news to me. I always thought it was one of these effusions, like, be realistic, demand the impossible. But this was actually something floated in order to brand a phenomenon. It was branding before there was branding. So, there was a lot of excitement about the Worker-Student Alliance in '68, but then it wasn't there. The workers wanted improved working conditions and higher pay, and not, they wanted the bosses to cool it out a bit, but they didn't want a sexy utopia. They wanted improved lives as workers. And there were very many of such tensions but I would say a lot of people were not aware that this was problematic. And certainly, I should add, I'm going on too long here, the right conflated them, tended to conflate them. So in the speeches of Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon and so on, there was only this one big thing: campus bums. They don't want to work. They want to have. They want too much sex and too much drugs, and they also want to bring our civilization crashing down. And they want a person of the wrong color to marry your daughter. And somehow it was all sort of a blob of that made for a convenient enemy. Thank you.
Just a clarification, beneath the paving stones, the beach is the slogan of the Situationists International and Guy Debord in the 60s.
That's not what these guys say.
They're wrong.
Okay, I'm an empiricist. I'll look further into it.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have two questions. One is a kind of a theoretical question. The second is like a real political strategy question. So I wanted to go back to the start of your talk when you contrasted structure with texture, and just ask you to reflect a little bit on kind of your current thinking about how those two relate, which seem to me to be questions of '68 that are either different now or similar now, or those two seem like two really powerful theoretical terms that I'd be curious to hear you think a little bit more about. And the second real political question is about liberalism and the kind of, are we kind of stuck on a record that's skipping about the relationship between liberalism and radicalism from '68 to even the last election? Or is that a fundamentally different relationship on the left that's being misrecognized as something from the '60s that now is different? So those are my two very different questions.
Okay, let me take the second one first. The first presidential election I remember really was the election of John F. Kennedy, although I did go to a rally for Adlai Stevenson the previous election as a high school kid. There was a sense from then on in the new movements, civil rights, anti-nuclear, and eventually anti-Vietnam War and the rest, that America was in the middle of a kind of half-assed reform. There were half-assed reformers in charge. If you read the Port Huron Statement, which is the founding document of SDS, there's a great deal there about possibilities under Kennedy. This was written in '62. Possibilities under Kennedy, and meantime Kennedy is not acting sufficiently with respect to civil rights. He's a cold warrior, and so on and so on. But there was a sense of a dependency, which I don't think was all, well, I would say among the more strategically minded people in the movement, it did rise to consciousness that America was now a liberal country. That is to say, the New Deal, which had begun in 1933, And it had been somewhat interrupted by Eisenhower's interregnum, but Eisenhower was, by today's terms, a liberal. So we took for granted, I say we generically, that there was this foundation that we were resting on. So the next step was to move from liberalism to some kind of radicalism. That seemed logical, and it seemed plausible. I mean, these were years when the very militant young civil rights workers of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Organizing Committee, were part of coalitions which met with the Attorney General of the United States, Bobby Kennedy. They were getting money from liberal foundations to register voters in the South. There was this coexistence. And I think we took that for granted. I could say for my own part, I did. It was hard to imagine in 1968 that we would be here. John Mitchell, who was Nixon's Attorney General, said during one demonstration huge demonstration in '69, this country is going so far to the right, you're not going to recognize it. And it happened. It might have happened in the 70s had Nixon not ordered one too many burglaries. We were close, and I don't have time to go into all this, but we now have a whole wave of scholarship on what the FBI was up to in 1969, 70, and into the early 70s, that they were preparing concentration camps. They were preparing to reopen the Japanese internment camps in the West. And it was scotched. It's a complicated story. The book to read is Bad Moon Rising by a historian named Arthur Eckstein. This comes from FBI documents discovered and declassified after 40 years from the time of a trial of high FBI officials in the 70s. So so the radicalism rested on liberalism, and also, in an important way, rested on affluence and the expectation of affluence. I mean, I just went by this very quickly by talking about the oil crisis, but you have to realize that in the run-up to the oil embargo of 1973, gasoline was selling for 24 cents a gallon. Now, I mean, I don't know what the multiplication factor would be, but life was cheap, and this was also an important element in the sociology of the counterculture and the movement. That is, you could live, you could rent. I mean, I had a nice apartment in a poor neighborhood in Chicago, a poor white neighborhood, and my rent was $125 a month in the mid-1960s. You could live easy. There were 2-digit rents that could be had in the East Village. So we were coasting on that. It's easy to misinterpret this and say, well, you people had it easy because you sort of vaguely knew you could drop out and then you could drop back in. And there's some truth to that, but it's not the big truth that has frequently been preached by those who said, well, these were just a bunch of spoiled rich kids, which in general was not true at all. Anyway, so so that world imploded, and I think it's hard today. I think the resistance gets this. I think that the resistance understands that you need a political platform to operate on. That if Donald Trump and his ilk control the institutions of government, we're running into walls. So this concentrates the mind on a certain realistic apprehension of where we are. And I think one of the lessons of the last years, and there were many contributing elements, is that the backlash was simmering there. I mean, just as the left simmers, the right simmers. And there's a direct line from the Wallace campaign, in fact, from the terrorist governors of the Deep South in the early 60s, to the Wallace campaign of 68, to the Reagan campaign. There was a reason why Ronald Reagan launched his campaign at the county fairgrounds outside Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers had been murdered. He may not have known what it was, but his handlers certainly knew what Philadelphia, Mississippi was. That's been rumbling all the way through and never gave up. And it was rumbling through the Republican Party of the 80s. It was rumbling through Pat Buchanan's campaign and David Duke's campaign. And in the meantime, these people went to work and took over local politics. So it's very important not to take the platform, the platform for granted. Now, I've forgotten your first question. I'm sorry?
Structure and texture.
Oh, structure and texture, yeah. Okay, so I was serious with my little parable at the beginning. So imagine it's 1968, and you're reading about the Tet Offensive. And meantime, Gene McCarthy's running for president, and he's got, I think, 43% of the vote in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire against a sitting president. It's said that some of those who voted for Gene McCarthy thought they were voting for Joe McCarthy. I don't know that that's true, but in any case, this is an upheaval in the ruling party. And then Bobby Kennedy, having hesitated, comes in. And then Johnson's end of career speech, March 31st. Then the assassination of King. By the way, I'm leaving out a bunch of lesser massacres that took place here and there, mostly in the South and outside the national press. There were demonstrators murdered in places like Orangeburg, South Carolina. And then into the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Chicago, and tons of Columbia uprising, San Francisco State uprising, vast numbers of uprisings, and now by this time we're getting toward attacks on RSCC headquarters and so on, some violence against property. Now, try to make judicious judgments in that atmosphere. That's my point about the texture. And that's why I have great respect for your group here who kept all of us who were taking our respective means of transportation and kept this together. Because that's a real feat when a storm is blowing in and there's wild history. And I think this is a material force in history. That is to say, when the texture of everyday life is so bumpy, is so jarring, it leaves you in a disturbed state. I think I often feel something like that now. I don't know how many people do. I expect, my slogan for the age of Trump is all bets are off. So texture is, I think, a force. So yes, it operates through structures and around structures. The structures don't go away, but the sheer weirdness and pace of things, especially as magnified through media, and then we're just talking about television. Now we're talking about 24-hour news and social media and so on. It's like one goes through life in a daze. And by the way, this is not just true of the resistance. Obviously, true of the White House. So this is, it's kind of thrilling, and jarring, and disturbing, and crazy. And I can't discard that the craziness at the center. I can't say that is only a sort of epiphenomenon of political economy. That's what I mean to say.
So we have time for one more short question. And yeah, one quick question. And if you have a longer question, join us at dinner and we can take it up there. So.
Thank you for your leadership. I wonder what you think about the notion of it was the baby boomers who provided the energy there in the 60s and 68, that generation, my generation. And to what degree the fact that a lot of it went back into hibernation afterwards was a byproduct of who we were raised by. I mean, my dad, 4 years in the Pacific in World War II, and they got back and they were just happy to be alive and raised us and leave it to beaver land. And, when my sister came of age, he said, okay, you can go be a scientist. And she became, a pioneering feminist scientist. And when I got my draft card, I said, what should I do, Dad? And you spent 4 years in the Pacific. I honor that. He said, you're not going there. That's not what I fought for. But you got to make sure that nobody else goes too. It can't be just about you, otherwise it's not about anything. So we had that moment, and my sister plowed her way through, all the barriers in academia against female scientists, and I did what I could do to ride your coattails, and then it just kind of drifted away, because Dad went back to voting for Nixon and Ford and Reagan and just going to work and coming home and being grateful that he survived, the war. And I think a lot of us baby boomers just finally did see, let's just relax now. We got through it. That was tumultuous. That was that almost fake time. And it was a byproduct of who we were raised by, I think, to some degree. But what do you think about the generational influence on us being able to sustain this stuff?
Okay, I'm going to put on my research hat for a moment. All the research of which I'm aware of what happened to 60s activists, and there's not very much. I'm aware of 2 studies, one of UC Santa Barbara and the other of Florida State, show that those who were activist and radical or what have you in the 60s continued to be active politically, left-wing, and make less money than their peers. Now, these studies are now 20 years old, so I don't know if anybody's ever followed up, but those are the only empirical studies of which I'm aware. Insofar as anybody's been interested in the question, what they're aware of is that Jerry Rubin, who I mentioned before, who was sort of the Donald Trump of his time, except he didn't own anything, when he announced that money was the greatest thing on wheels, or whatever it was he said, money's the new power, or something like that, and he announced that he was going to work as a broker, that was a big story. Everybody heard about that. Okay? I mean, you see, it's there were many, many more people who went on doing this or that, community organizers, feminist organizers, union organizers, another whole story. Maybe it would have been better if there had been more union organizers, but a number of people I knew became union leaders in one form or other and remained active, and to this day. I mean, just to mention, are you aware of the book called The Color of Race that was published last year by Richard Rothstein? It's an amazing book about the ways in which racial segregation in the cities, including in the North, was not just a function of a lot of people a lot of white people deciding on white flight. It was a matter of government policy. Okay? Local governments created segregated neighborhoods. Much of what follows in the horrendous segregation of the present was actually enshrined by the state. Now, Richard Rothstein's one of my oldest friends, I'm proud to say. We were involved in SDS together. We were involved in community organizing together. And after the 60s, he decided to become a union organizer. and he organized a national boycott of the J.P. Stevens linen sheets and pillowcases company because there was a strike on. And then he became first the administrative director and then the actual elected leader of the textile workers union in California. And before he went off on his subsequent careers as an education policy writer and as a very significant researcher. So there were a few people like him. It's an exemplary life. Not enough, but more than you would know because of all the people who did quiet work and weren't in it for the celebrity. So they're out there. So, yeah, of course. One other thing about baby boomers. I say this, I'm not a baby boomer. I'm a war baby. Okay. And what people talk about baby boomers, they're speaking of a particular hunk of baby boomers. Not all baby boomers went to college. In fact, most did not, even with the great education boom. Most baby boomers were Americans. The culture of the 60s, while the culture of what we call the culture of the 60s was happening, the culture of the 50s was still happening. You saw those popular TV shows. People were still listening to, Tony Bennett and Perry Como and so on. I love Tony Bennett, nothing against him. And by the way, another well-punctured myth, there's a marvelous piece of scholarship by Penny Lewis called Hippies and Hard Hats. I recommend it very highly. She using poll data from the 60s, she punctures the idea that the working class was pro-war and hated the hippies. I know this sounds shocking. She's got the goods. She's got the evidence. Okay? Yes, everybody knows that a bunch of Wall Street hard hats, led by a Republican construction trades leader, beat up a bunch of anti-war people on Wall Street at a demonstration in 1969 or 70. But that was not the labor movement as a whole. So it's all so much more complicated than the stereotype of either of yippies or their later reincarnation as yuppies. The baby booming, Donald Trump is a baby boomer. I rest my case.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next session is at 7 p.m. Race and